In this video, we're going to focus on how to diagram some more involved sentences, like complex sentences with dependent clauses. I largely illustrate with English sentences, but the principles will hold for Greek, and I'll try to point that out very clearly as we go. And this is going to be based upon what we learned about basic sentence diagramming. For example, I'm not going to go into the way to diagram an adjective or the way to diagram a subject and a verb. I'm assuming you've already looked at the other video and are going to be up on that kind of information. So let me first define my terms. A compound sentence is a sentence that contains two or more simple sentences. For example, I went to the store and I bought some milk. We've got two simple sentences here that are joined by the conjunction and. And so this is a pretty common sentence structure that we see a lot in Greek, specifically in the Gospels, where a story is being told and one detail is given and then another detail is given, etc. Now, when you diagram sentences like this, you really have two options that you can do. The first is what we would call branching. Now, you're familiar with branching from working with simple sentences where you, for example, have a compound subject or a compound predicate. But with branching, we can do something very, very similar, even on the level of the sentence. And so if I were to diagram the first sentence, and then I were to diagram the second sentence, I could then join them by branching. This is an easy way to diagram a compound sentence, and it shows very clearly how they relate. Now, the difficulty with this is that very often when we ask you to diagram something in Greek, you might start with a conjunction that at the beginning of the verse that goes back to something we're not going to diagram. So this is where we need to introduce the idea of what we call a signpost conjunction. And let's imagine that we're going to diagram this sentence structure again. So I would diagram the first, and then I would diagram the second sentence. I could show the conjunction that joins these two by using what we call a signpost. And that would be at the beginning of the second sentence. I would draw a little small platform, so to speak, that stands above the sentence, and that's where I would put my conjunction. It acts as a signpost to tell you that it is actually connected to something that precedes. If, for example, we did not have the first sentence, maybe I give you a verse that lacks the first sentence, we could then diagram the second sentence all by itself and show how that conjunction actually points to the prior context. Now, the second type of sentence that we're going to work with is called a complex sentence. And again, the definition is a complex sentence is a sentence that contains at least one simple sentence and a dependent clause. Now, a clause is a dependent element that contains a verbal element, but it can't stand on its own. A dependent clause specifically will show that it relates to something else, and that's why they show up within the complex sentence structure. It's modifying the simple sentence in some form or fashion. And so you've got three basic ways in Greek that we can identify a dependent clause. You can use a subordinating conjunction and a verb, you can use a participle, or you can use an infinitive. And I'll illustrate this with English, and as you learn these elements in class, you'll be able to figure out how this works. But let's imagine this sentence. I went to the store because I needed milk. Now, in this particular sentence, we have a simple sentence, I went to the store, and then we have a dependent clause, because I needed milk. This particular dependent clause is marked with a subordinating conjunction, and then a subject and a verb that go along with it. Now the question is, how would we diagram this? It's actually fairly simple. The best way to think of this is as two sentences that are going to be joined by a particular structure. Let me clear the decks and show you how this would work. Let's diagram the first sentence, the simple sentence. And now let's diagram the dependent clause, every part of it except for the subordinating conjunction. The only thing I need to do now is to connect the two. I do this with what we call in diagramming language a right slanted terrace. And then on that right slanted terrace, I include the subordinating conjunction. So you can see here we have our structure diagrammed, and we have both our sentences intact. We have our simple sentence up here, and then we have our dependent clause here, and they're connected with this right slanted terrace. The second way you can indicate a dependent clause in Greek is through a participle. Participles are oftentimes used adverbially to create a dependent clause. So let's imagine this sentence. Now, this is not a very good English sentence, but this is the kind of sentence that we would see in Greek with a dependent participle. And the participle can be used to show, for example, purpose or result. But the long and short is that we have our same sentence structure as before. We have a simple sentence and then a dependent clause. So the question is, how do we actually diagram this? Well, let me do the same thing I did before. Now, the difference is that we can't diagram a dependent clause with a participle using the right slanted terrace. That's only for a subordinating conjunction. So here I'm going to use a vertical terrace, and then my participle phrase will go down here. Now, what you'll notice is that the participle, because it's a verb, can have a direct object. And so I'll use the same direct object marker that I would do before. So now we're showing the same thing, but now we're using the vertical terrace to show the dependent structure. We have our simple sentence and then our dependent clause with the participle being indicated by that vertical terrace. Let's imagine one more sentence with an infinitive. The infinitive is the third way that you can identify a dependent clause in Greek. So let's imagine that we have this sentence. We've got our same basic structure as before, a simple sentence and then a dependent clause. This dependent clause is marked with an infinitive. The diagramming of this is very similar to what we did with the participle just now. I'll use a vertical terrace, and here I'll mark it as an infinitive with this special double line. And then as before, because the infinitive is a verb, if it has a direct object or other modifiers, I will include those as well. So the sentence structure is showing exactly what we need to see. We have our simple sentence and then our dependent clause, here marked with an infinitive that is a modifier of our main clause. One structure that's very important to know how to diagram is a relative clause. A relative clause is very, very interesting because it is basically dependent in a special way. It's not dependent necessarily adverbially. Sometimes it's dependent adjectively. So let's imagine this sentence. Let's imagine this sentence. Here we have a simple sentence with a relative clause. We know it's a relative clause because it has the relative pronoun. Now, if you were to discuss the function of the relative clause, you can see that it's modifying store. It's describing store in this particular fashion. Now, how do we diagram this? Well, we would do it basically like we did the dependent clause. We diagram both of them, and then we need to figure out how they're connected. Notice that in the relative clause, I put my relative pronoun where it functions in the sentence. In this particular example, the relative pronoun is the subject of its clause, so it would go in the subject slot. If it were the direct object, I would put it there or wherever it might go. Now, the only thing that I need to do to finish this is to somehow show the connection. Earlier, we pointed out that this relative pronoun has its antecedent, the word store. And so all I have to do to finish this is draw a dotted line which connects my relative pronoun back to the antecedent. And that shows the connection between the two. That wraps up what you need to know in terms of more complex sentences. Remember, this video is based upon what you know about simple sentences and how to diagram the subject, the verb, the direct object, modifiers, etc. And the key here is what are the proper ways to connect a simple sentence to a simple sentence or a simple sentence to a dependent clause. And the key concepts to remember are signpost conjunctions, which will look like this, and then right slanted terraces, which will look like this, and that connects a subordinating conjunction and its clause back to the simple sentence. And then the idea that all dependent verbal ideas can have their own subjects, modifiers, direct objects, etc. Like, for example, if you have a participle, it could have its direct object with a modifier and then an adverbial modifier, etc. I hope this is helpful, and I look forward to working with you on learning this better.